Hello everyone. The title of this talk is Palestinians and Israelis, Subjective Perceptions, Objective Realities. And I begin with a question. How to bring to an end the seemingly endless conflict involving Palestinians and Israelis? It's a simple question. The hard part is the answer. In reality, after decades of bloody combat and failed international diplomacy, no one really has a clue about what to do next. I shall come back to this with one or two thoughts. My first serious encounter with this tragic issue was on the 5th of June 1967, when war abruptly broke out between Israel and neighbouring Arab states. It so happens I was president of the Students' Union at the University of Birmingham, and as I arrived at the union building that day, I was waylaid by a hurricane of student activists of every persuasion, all eager to educate me on the rights and wrongs of the conflict. It was an intense immersion course. By the end of the week, I was so much better informed and so much more confused. Later, I got caught up in national student politics as NUS Deputy President and international student politics, where Israel-Palestine pervaded every agenda, as it still does. Over the years, I have acquired a close affinity with both peoples and have remained heavily embroiled with the issue. I know how complicated it can all seem. But I don't think I've come across anything that provides more insight than a simple adage attributed to Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War that goes something like this. If you were born where they were born, and you were taught what they were taught, you'd believe what they believe. While falling short of a complete general theory, it goes some way to explaining not just what we believe, but why we believe it. Why we, whoever we happen to be, take up certain positions and hold them so fervently. But what would we believe if we held from the other side of the track? What facts would we then be predisposed to accept as self-evident truths, and which ones would we be inclined summarily to dismiss as propaganda lies? None of this is to suggest that facts are merely subjective, nor that there are not genuine questions of historical interpretation, justice, legality, or human rights. Of course there are. What is suggestive, though, is that if progress is ever to be made, there is a vital need to think beyond our comfort zones. For we are trapped in and by our own narratives, and we devote enormous resources to justifying and reinforcing our own perspectives, and simultaneously to belittling or ridiculing the others. This is not the prerogative of any one side. All sides do it. Self-appointed experts churn out reams of supposedly scholarly research that prove the non-authenticity of the nationhood or peoplehood of the other and the non-validity of their cherished claims. Some portray the other side as innately wicked. But these self-serving tomes are completely without value. They add nothing to the sum total of human knowledge or wisdom. Worse, they demonize whole peoples, falsify their histories, disparage their suffering, deepen the hatred, and poison the air. Their solutions invariably involve the capitulation or subordination of the adversary. They offer no real solutions. They merely condemn us all to eternal conflict. Indeed, there is a serious risk of this. But such a future is not preordained. Israelis and Palestinians clashed in modern times, not because of ancient ideological or religious disputes, but because they simultaneously aspired to the same piece of territory on which to exercise their self-determination. This is the root of the conflict, the bitter product of generations of virulent European anti-Semitism at home and rampant imperialism abroad. Everything else has been grafted on retrospectively. In the early 1970s, on embarking on a doctoral thesis on the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, I agreed with my supervisor to write a short history of the conflict as the introductory chapter. He stressed the need for it to be objective, even-handed, impartial, and balanced, and warned against being swayed by the emotions and passions of either side. You know the sort of thing. But I soon found I could not make even the most basic facts sit still long enough to get them down on paper. Then came my eureka moment, the realization that what I was trying to do was not achievable. There wasn't one history, but two discrete histories, stemming from two distinct peoples with quite different pasts, whose destinies happened to collide at the same moment of time. So with some trepidation, I adopted an entirely different approach, one that entailed seeing the conflict as the protagonists themselves saw it, subjectively, through their eyes, each in turn, with all the imbalances and emotions and historical traumas, even the distortions, fabrications and fictions left in. For factual inaccuracies or mythologies, when thought to be true, are no less potent than factual truths in the minds of those who believe them. This, I found, was the only way of making sense of disputed facts and coming to grips with what made both sides tick. Of course, objective analysis is vital, but only after exploring empathically the subjective perceptions. Otherwise, it is what I have called phony objectivity. Applying this methodology, I authored a pamphlet, A Tale of Two Peoples, published in January 1973, which mapped out the principal narratives and concluded that key to resolving the conflict was the creation of an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza Strip alongside Israel, what in later years came to be known as the two-state solution. It was plain to me that both peoples overwhelmingly wanted their own state and were not prepared to settle for anything less. I could see no other way of accommodating and reconciling their common, basic, minimum, irreducible aspirations. To illustrate, what follows is a brief attempt to sketch the two core perspectives, although drastically condensing them in this way inevitably carries the risk of doing them an injustice. It makes sense, chronologically, to start with the Israeli-Jewish perspective and then move on to the Palestinian-Arab perspective. The underlying case for a Jewish homeland was strikingly, if inadvertently, put by the British poet Lord Byron as far back as 1815, when some of the worst tragedies to face the Jewish people, including the Tsarist pogroms and the Nazi Holocaust, still lay a distance ahead. Byron wrote, "The wild dove hath her nest, the fox his cave, mankind their country, Israel but the grave." By Israel, of course, he meant the Jewish people. Once the Zionist movement eventually came into being, however, several decades later, all sorts of conspiracy theories and malevolent intent were fastened onto it by its detractors, some of it giving off a familiar anti-Semitic whiff, not so different from that which played the decisive role in winning so many Jews and others to the Zionist cause in the first place. Conceptually, Zionism was a distressed people's proud if defiant response to centuries of contempt, humiliation, discrimination, and periodic bouts of murderous oppression. The Israeli state was the would-be phoenix to rise from the Jewish embers, still smouldering in the blood-soaked earth of another continent. The underlying purpose was the affirmative one of achieving safety and justice for a tormented people, not the negative one of doing damage to another people. Yet, in the attempt to rectify the enduring Jewish calamity, the reality, as we step out of one pair of shoes and step into the other, is that damage was inflicted on another people, on the hapless Palestinian Arabs who paid a heavy price and are still paying it. The Palestinians, like all colonized peoples, had long yearned for their independence free from foreign rule, only to find that in their case, another people, mostly from foreign parts, was simultaneously laying claim to the same land. Naturally, the Palestinians resisted. Any people would have resisted. The Palestinians, in like fashion, did not set out to damage anyone, but aspired to what they felt was rightfully theirs. Displaced, dispossessed and deserted, they were among the principal losers in the geopolitical lottery that followed the horrors of the Second World War. their original felony was in essence to be in the way of another distressed people's frantic survival strategy, fueled by an industrial genocide for which the Palestinians bore no responsibility. Virtually everything that has happened since then is in some way a consequence of this fateful clash of historical forces. As these renditions signify, the core case for each side has its own internal justification, which is not snuffed out because the other side also has, in its own terms, a compelling case. 44 years on, I still cannot see a plausible alternative to self-determination and statehood in one form or another for both peoples as the essential framework of a settlement, since there is very little authentic support for anything else. Most of the myriad one-state alternatives are ill thought out, unrealistic, and often contradictory, and would deny national rights to either or both peoples. Thus they are viewed as deeply threatening by one side or the other, or by both sides. The more likely alternative to two states by design is two states by disaster, which may come about eventually through a full-scale Palestinian uprising on the West Bank. The bottom line is that it is hard to conceive the long-suffering Palestinian Arabs, after all they have been through, not just at the hands of the Israeli state, but at the hands of Arab states too, ever giving up their struggle for independence. Just as it is hard to imagine the Israeli Jews, after some 2,000 turbulent years, ever agreeing to become a minority again in someone else's land. However, this is not to rule out a future confederative arrangement for Israel, Palestine, and maybe Jordan too, along the lines of Benelux. But it is instructive to note that the constituent states of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg have retained their official independence and separate identities. National allegiances evidently continue to have an important appeal. This said, the growth in the number of Israeli settlers on the West Bank from fewer than 5,000 in the early 1970s to several hundred thousand today, coupled with the strong annexationist tendencies of the current Israeli government, is rendering the two-state outcome less feasible by today. If we lose the only plausible solution, we will indeed have to contend with a situation of perpetual conflict. In the end, both peoples will enjoy their places in the sun, or neither will. In other words, this is not a zero-sum conflict. But any suggestion of symmetry falls apart when you consider that one side there is an established state ruled by a sovereign government, and on the other side an occupied people represented by an organization. More than anything else, this structural imbalance explains the serial failures of the talks between the parties. It was always up to the international community to compensate for the imbalance, but the major powers have been persistently negligent in this regard. Now we are left with the consequences, a situation that can only be described as dire, and it just got a lot worse in the light of the radically altered geopolitical environment. But this is the Middle East, where the only thing we can expect with certainty is the unexpected. Almost every decisive development on the Arab-Israel front, at least since the war of 1973, was not anticipated by the experts, and the future may well be just as unpredictable. On this ground alone, there is some reason to temper the prevailing mood of despondency with a tinge of optimism. Not everything, though, is unpredictable. Sooner or later, occupations, like other forms of colonial rule, are resisted. This is probably one of the few cast iron laws of history. So, ending the occupation is the indispensable condition for breaking free of the current quagmire. No end of conflict is possible without this. So what, if anything, may be done? Here are two suggestions. The first is that there is an urgent need for all Palestinian and Israeli anti-occupation activists to come together to devise a common strategy that the rest of the world may then throw its support behind. historical inhibitions, primarily on the Palestinian side, about cooperating with each other for this sort of purpose, need to be set aside in the greater cause of unity in ending the occupation. The second is a suggestion for that strategy. The Palestinian-American thinker Sam Bahor and I have together put forward a proposal that the Israeli government be called upon either to recognize an independent Palestinian state imminently, or pending a future final agreement, whatever and whenever that might be, grant full civil and political rights in the meantime to everyone living under Israeli jurisdiction. Before I conclude, I should like to address a question that is perhaps lingering in the minds of some of you, namely, can the subjective approach I have outlined help us to understand and maybe even resolve other conflicts? Well, I hesitate to generalize, and of course no two conflicts are the same, and I don't at all suggest it is a sufficient approach on its own, but insofar as it requires listening empathetically before leaping to judgments and entails not imposing on the other parties our own values, preferences, or prejudices, even if subconscious, I think it can be a vital tool of analysis, whether the conflict is at the international, national, or local levels, or even just within families or between friends. By all means, try it yourselves sometimes, and maybe let us know. Thank you.